There are thresholds in your life that you only recognize once you've crossed them. They aren't grand, arched doorways with ornate carvings and heavy oaken doors. They are quiet, unassuming things. The space between one breath and the next. The subtle shift of light as a cloud passes overhead. The moment a familiar silence changes its texture and becomes something new, something weighted with unspoken possibilities. For me, that threshold was the foot of my bed, and the person who led me across it was currently fast asleep on my pillow, breathing softly into the quiet landscape of my room, completely unaware that he had just redrawn the entire map of my world. His name was Julian, and he was, for all intents and purposes, my straight roommate. He was also, for all my own intents and purposes, the densest, most beautiful, and most maddening celestial body to ever be caught in my quiet orbit. Tonight, he had come to my room under the familiar, almost sacred pretext of studying for his thermodynamics midterm. It had become our ritual over the past few months, a silent agreement forged in the crucible of his recent, messy breakup and the shared stress of junior year. His room, he claimed, was too full of ghosts and distractions. Mine, by contrast, was a sanctuary of calm, organized, quiet, smelling faintly of the darkroom chemicals that clung to my clothes and the old books that lined my shelves. It was a space I had meticulously curated for my own peace of mind, and he had, with the casual grace of a planet settling into its rotation, made it his own secondary habitat. The ritual was always the same. He would appear at my door, usually around 9, a stack of engineering textbooks in one arm and a mug of rapidly cooling coffee in the other. He'd offer a tired, lopsided smile that always made something in my chest ache with a dull, familiar throb. "Hey," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "Mind if I camp out in here? Professor Davies is trying to actually end me with this problem set," and I would always say yes. I would nod, step aside, and watch as he settled himself on the floor, his back against my bed frame, creating a small island of academic chaos amidst my sea of tranquility. We would work in comfortable silence for an hour, maybe 2. The only sounds were the scratch of his pencil, the click of my camera shutter as I edited photos, and the soft rustle of turning pages. It was a silence I had come to crave, a shared quiet that felt more intimate than any conversation. Then, inevitably, the shift would happen. His pencil would slow, the page turning would cease. His head, heavy with formulas and fluid dynamics, would begin to nod. I would watch him fight it from the corner of my eye, pretending to be absorbed in the delicate dance of light and shadow on my monitor. I'd see his eyelids flutter, his shoulders slump. He'd try to rally, shaking his head and blinking hard, but sleep was a tide he couldn't fight. Eventually, he would surrender. He would mumble something incoherent about taking a 5-minute break, and then he would simply stop. His head would come to rest against the side of my mattress, his breathing deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Tonight, however, had been different. A new, terrifying variable had been introduced into our carefully balanced equation. An hour into our session, he'd sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion, and pushed his textbook away. "My back is killing me," he'd murmured, more to himself than to me. He'd stretched, his long limbs unfolding like the wings of some magnificent, tired bird. Then he'd looked at the empty half of my queen-sized bed. It was a vast, wide expanse of possibility, a space I never, ever used. I always slept huddled on the far edge, as if respecting a boundary for a person who was never there. He'd looked at it, then at me, a silent question in his weary eyes. My heart had performed a frantic, panic tattoo against my ribs. I had given a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture I immediately wanted to snatch back from the air. That was all the permission he needed. He had crawled onto the bed, lying on his stomach on top of the covers, his textbook propped in front of him. "Just for a bit," he'd promised. "It's easier to read this way." And I had believed him, or at least, I had chosen to. But within 20 minutes, the textbook was lying forgotten, face down on the duvet. He had rolled onto his side, facing me, and sleep had claimed him utterly. And now here we were, Julian, asleep in my bed. The phrase itself felt like a foreign language I had only ever read in books, a concept too fragile and too potent to exist in my actual life. The soft glow from my desk lamp sculpted the contours of his face, catching on the sharp line of his jaw, and the surprisingly long, dark sweep of his eyelashes. His mouth was slightly parted, and with each exhalation, a wisp of his dark hair stirred against the white pillowcase. He looked younger in sleep, the usual tension around his eyes smoothed away, the confident set of his shoulders softened into vulnerability. He looked peaceful, and I was in agony. Every nerve ending in my body was screamingly aware of his proximity. He was only a few feet away, but he might as well have been fused to my spine. I could feel the subtle warmth radiating from his body, a low-grade fever in the cool air of the room. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo, a mix of something like sandalwood and citrus, mingling with the familiar smell of my own laundry detergent on the sheets. It was an impossibly intimate combination, a sensory signature of a line being irrevocably crossed. I sat frozen at my desk, my own body rigid with a strange cocktail of terror and a yearning so profound it felt like a physical hollowness in my chest. This was a dangerous new territory. The floor had been a buffer, a mode of plausible deniability. The floor said, "We are friends, and one of us is tired." The bed said something else entirely. It whispered of things I had spent years carefully packing away and storing in the most inaccessible corners of my heart. My friendship with Julian was, without exaggeration, one of the most important structures in my life. It was a carefully built thing, assembled over 2.5 years with patience, mutual respect, and a vast, unspoken understanding. We had met through the university's online housing portal, two disparate data points algorithmically matched by our declared levels of cleanliness and our non-smoking habits. I remember seeing his profile picture for the first time, a sun-drenched photo of him grinning, mid-laugh, on the deck of a boat, the wind whipping his hair into a chaotic mess. He looked bright, open, and utterly carefree. He was a swimmer, an engineering major, a volunteer at the local animal shelter. His profile radiated a kind of golden, effortless competence. My own profile felt like a pale, monochrome sketch in comparison, a blurry, self-timed photo of me in a darkroom, my face half hidden by my camera. Photography major. Quiet. Likes old movies and rainy days. I was certain he would take one look and click next, but he hadn't. He'd sent me a message, direct and simple. "Hey, you seem cool. Not a party animal, which is a plus. Apartment looks decent. Want to be roommates?" And just like that, the foundation was laid. The first few months were a study in polite coexistence. We were two different species learning to share a habitat. He moved through the apartment like a contained weather system, a whirlwind of damp towels, protein shake blenders, and the faint, ever-present scent of chlorine. His energy was boundless. He would be up at 5 for morning practice, back for classes, then off to the gym or the library, a blur of motion and purpose. I, on the other hand, moved through the world as an observer. My hours were fluid, dictated by the quality of the light or the slow, patient process of developing film. I would spend hours in the darkroom, lost in the alchemy of silver and light, or wander the city with my camera, searching for stories in the faces of strangers and the geometry of forgotten alleyways. We found our rhythm in the quiet spaces. In the early mornings, when I'd be up late editing and he'd be up early for practice, we'd sometimes cross paths in the kitchen. We wouldn't say much. He'd grunt a greeting while pouring cereal. I'd nod back over my mug of tea. But there was a comfort in that shared solitude, a silent acknowledgement that we were both awake while the rest of the world slept. We learned each other's habits, each other's preferences. I knew he liked his coffee black and his toast slightly burnt. He knew I couldn't stand the sound of the television and that I always left a small bowl of water out for the stray cat that frequented our fire escape. We built a friendship not on grand conversations or shared wild nights, but on 1,000 tiny, mundane acts of consideration. He'd bring me a pastry from the good bakery near the pool. I'd make sure to buy the brand of orange juice he liked. It was a language of small gestures, a quiet architecture of care. My feelings for him were a secret I kept like a photograph sealed in a light-proof box, something I knew existed but dared not expose to the air. It had happened gradually, in slow creeping of ivy up the walls of my carefully constructed defenses. It wasn't just his looks, though he was undeniably beautiful in the way of classical statues. All clean lines and balanced proportions. It was the way he'd get a small, concentrated frown between his eyebrows when he was working on a difficult problem. It was the unrestrained joy in his laugh when he watched a stupid video on his phone. It was the surprising gentleness in his hands when he coaxed the shy fire escape cat into letting him stroke its back. He was a person made of sunlight, and I, who had always been more comfortable in the shadows, found myself wanting to turn my face toward his warmth. I guarded this secret fiercely. It was my own private, contained universe of feeling. To let it out would be to risk everything. The easy quiet, the comfortable rhythm, the entire foundation of the life we had built together. I was the quiet observer, the platonic roommate. That was my role. And for 2 years, I played it perfectly. The shift, the first hairline crack in that foundation, came on a Tuesday night in October. It had been raining for 3 days straight, a miserable, persistent drizzle that left the whole world feeling gray and waterlogged. Julian had been with his girlfriend, Sarah, for almost a year. She was nice enough, I suppose. Pretty, smart, a pre-law student with a laugh that was a little too loud. When she was over, the apartment felt different, occupied by an energy that wasn't ours. The comfortable silence would be filled with chatter, the air thick with a perfume I didn't recognize. I didn't dislike her, but I was always quietly relieved when she left and our apartment returned to its natural state of equilibrium. That night, Julian came home late. I was in the living room, ostensibly reading, but mostly just listening to the rain. I heard his key in the lock, the soft click of the door closing. But instead of his usual cheerful, "I'm home," or the sound of him dropping his bag and heading for the kitchen, there was only silence. I waited a few moments, then looked over the back of the couch. He was just standing there in the entryway, dripping onto the mat, his shoulders slumped. His face, illuminated by the dim light from the street, was pale and hollowed out. He looked like a ship that had been battered by a storm, all of its sails torn away. "Julian," I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He looked up, and his eyes were glassy, unfocused. "We broke up," he said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were reporting a fact he had read in a newspaper. He didn't offer any details, and I didn't ask for any. He didn't seem to want sympathy or advice. He just seemed empty. He walked past me, shed his wet jacket, and went into his room, closing the door behind him. I didn't see him again for the rest of the night. The next day, the apartment was unnervingly quiet. The usual morning sounds of his routine were absent. When he finally emerged from his room around noon, he looked like he hadn't slept. He moved like a ghost, pouring a cup of coffee he didn't drink, staring out the window at the relentless rain. The vibrant energy that always surrounded him was gone, replaced by a heavy, static quiet. I didn't know what to do. The architecture of our friendship was built for comfort, not for crisis. I was the keeper of quiet spaces, not the mender of broken hearts. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I gave him silence. I made a fresh pot of coffee, left a mug on the counter for him, and retreated to my room, leaving the door slightly ajar, a silent signal that the space was there if he needed it. A few hours later, a shadow fell across my doorway. I looked up from my work. It was Julian, leaning against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked lost. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "What are you working on?" It was the first question he had asked me in 24 hours. I told him I was editing a series of photos I'd taken at the old train yard. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. He looked at my bookshelf, my desk, the prints pinned to my corkboard. His gaze was searching for something, an anchor in the storm. "Can I?" he started, gesturing vaguely into the room. "Can I just sit in here for a bit? My room feels," he trailed off, not needing to finish. I understood. His room was full of Sarah. Photos, gifts, memories. My room was neutral territory. It was just a room. It was safe. "Of course," I said, turning back to my screen to give him the illusion of privacy. He came in and sank onto the small, worn armchair in the corner, the one I used for reading. He didn't speak. He just sat there, surrounded by my things, by my quiet, and he breathed. I continued to work, the rhythmic click of my mouse a steady metronome in the silence. We sat like that for over an hour. He wasn't asking for anything from me. Not for conversation, not for comfort, not for a solution. He was just borrowing my peace, drawing on a stillness I had in surplus. It was a profound moment of trust, a quiet acknowledgement that the friendship we had built was strong enough to bear this new, unfamiliar weight. When he finally stood up to leave, he paused at the door. "Thanks, Leo," he said, and the gratitude in his voice was so raw, so genuine, that it struck me with the force of a physical blow. That was the moment the shift began. He had come to my room seeking sanctuary, and in doing so, he had unknowingly opened a door between our separate worlds, a door I never thought would be unlocked. And so the ritual began, born from that first act of seeking refuge. At first, it was sporadic. He'd appear at my door after a long day of classes and swim practice, looking drained. The pretense wasn't even studying yet. It was just a need to escape the four walls of his own room, which now seemed to suffocate him. He would sink into that same armchair, sometimes with a book, sometimes just staring into space. He rarely spoke of Sarah, but I knew she was the ghost that haunted the silence. I became an expert in the geography of his grief. I learned that the slight furrow in his brow meant he was replaying a conversation in his head. I learned that the way he rubbed his thumb over his knuckles was a sign that the loneliness was pressing in. I never offered platitudes or easy answers. I just offered him the quiet, a calm harbor where he could moor his battered ship for a while. I was his lighthouse, a steady, silent beam in his fog, and I was terrified of what would happen if he ever got close enough to see the man operating the light. The studying was the next evolution. Midterms were approaching, and the ambient stress on campus was a palpable hum. One evening, he showed up at my door with his thermodynamics textbook. "My brain is fried," he announced, forgoing any other greeting. "I've read the same page 6 times. I thought maybe a change of scenery would help." That was the first time he settled on the floor, his back against my bed. It felt like a significant escalation. The armchair was separate, an island of its own. The floor, leaning against my bed, was part of my central territory. It blurred the lines. I remember the intense, prickling awareness of his physical presence so close to my personal space. I could hear the soft whisper of his jacket sleeve against the carpet, the deeper timbre of his breathing. My own body was a study in stillness, a desperate attempt to project an aura of casual indifference, while my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. That was the first night he fell asleep. It happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it. The scratching of his pencil stopped. I glanced over and saw his head was tilted at an awkward angle, his chin resting on his chest. His textbook was still open on his lap, a monument to his failed effort. A wave of something impossibly tender washed over me. He looked so vulnerable, so completely spent. The weight of his academic pressure, his athletic commitments, and his broken heart had finally conspired to pull him under. I watched him for a long time, my own work forgotten. The lamplight traced the curve of his neck, the strong column of his throat. I had the wildest, most reckless urge to reach out and brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, anchoring myself to reality. I was his friend, his safe harbor, nothing more. After an hour, I quietly got up, retrieved the spare blanket from my closet, and draped it over his shoulders. He stirred, murmuring something unintelligible, but didn't wake. I went back to my desk, my mind a chaotic swirl of emotions. I had offered him comfort, a simple, friendly gesture, but it felt like a confession. The blanket was a proxy for my own hands, a way of touching him without actually touching him. It was a dangerous, exhilarating game of plausible deniability. From then on, the ritual was set. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would come to my room to study. The academic pretense grew thinner with each visit. We both knew he wasn't there for thermodynamics. He was there for the quiet, for the unspoken permission to let his guard down. He was there to sleep. And I was his willing accomplice, the silent enabler of his exhaustion. I would watch him fight his losing battle with sleep, a small, secret part of me anticipating the moment of his surrender, the moment when the rigid lines of his posture would soften, and he would finally allow himself to rest. It was a strange kind of intimacy, this shared ritual of his vulnerability. I was the keeper of his unconsciousness, the sole witness to his unguarded moments. I learned the specific cadence of his sleep breathing, the way it would sometimes catch in a soft snore before evening out again. I learned that he sometimes twitched in his sleep, his fingers flexing as if gripping a phantom pull buoy. These were tiny, intimate details that felt like stolen secrets, clues to the inner workings of the man I was trying so desperately not to love. Then came tonight. The night he crossed the final boundary, the one I had foolishly believed was immutable. The night he chose my bed over the floor. When he'd first crawled onto the covers, my entire nervous system had gone into overdrive. The thin barrier of the duvet was all that separated his body from the space where I slept, a space that felt as private and personal as my own skin. I tried to focus on the pixels of the photograph on my screen, to lose myself in the familiar process of adjusting contrast and saturation. But it was impossible. His presence was a magnetic force, pulling all my attention toward him. I was acutely aware of every small shift of his weight on the mattress, every soft sigh that escaped his lips. The air in the room felt charged, thick with a new kind of tension. It wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly. It was something far more dangerous. It was electric. And now, as I sat watching him sleep, the full weight of the situation settled upon me. He was here, in my bed, looking as if he belonged. The sight was a perfect, heartbreaking tableau of everything I wanted and could never have. It was a beautiful, cruel mirage. For him, this was probably nothing. He was tired, my bed was comfortable, and our friendship was solid enough to accommodate this minor breach of protocol. He trusted me. That was the agonizing truth of it. He trusted me enough not to see the danger, not to feel the current of my longing that was strong enough to pull us both out to sea. He saw a friend, a quiet room, a place to rest. I saw the painful, beautiful landscape of a love story that would only ever exist in my own mind. I knew I should wake him. I should gently shake his shoulder and tell him he should go to his own bed. It was the sensible thing to do, the self-preservationist thing to do. Every moment he stayed, the roots of this impossible hope dug a little deeper into my heart, making the eventual, inevitable uprooting all the more painful. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was too selfish. I wanted to hoard this moment, to burn it into my memory like a photograph exposed for too long, letting the light saturate the film until the image was permanent and indelible. For just a little while longer, I could pretend. I could live in the fiction that this was normal, that this was ours. I could breathe in the same air, exist in the same small pocket of peace, and allow myself to feel the warmth of his proximity without the cold chill of reality setting in. I finally turned off my desk lamp, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the pale blue moonlight filtering through the window. I wouldn't be able to sleep, not now. So I decided to just sit, to keep watch. It felt like my duty, somehow, to guard his sleep, to hold the space for his exhaustion. The minutes stretched into an hour. The building fell silent around us. The only sound was his breathing, a steady, rhythmic reassurance in the dark. At some point, he shifted in his sleep. He rolled onto his back, and his arm, which had been tucked by his side, flopped outward, his hand landing on the empty pillow next to him, the pillow where my head should have been. My breath hitched. His fingers were curled slightly, his hand resting palm up, an unconscious invitation. It was a simple, meaningless movement, a random twitch of a sleeping body. But in the charged silence of the room, it felt like a question, a gesture I had to interpret. I stared at his hand, at the long, capable fingers, the clean, clipped nails, the faint network of veins just beneath the skin. It was the hand of an engineer, a swimmer, a hand that could solve complex equations and propel him through water with powerful grace. And it was just inches from me. The temptation to reach out, to just brush my fingertips against his, was a physical force, a gravitational pull. It would be so easy. A fleeting touch in the dark that he would never know about. A tiny theft of intimacy. But I resisted. I was the observer, not the participant. My role was to watch, to document, not to interfere. Touching him would change the composition of the scene, would make me a part of the story I was only supposed to be telling myself. The night wore on, a long, slow procession of quiet moments. I watched the moonlight crawl across the floor, tracing the outlines of my books, my camera, the discarded pile of Julian's clothes. The entire room felt like a sacred space, a terrarium containing this one fragile, impossible moment. I thought about the nature of friendship and the invisible lines we draw around it. For 2 years, Julian and I had respected those lines perfectly. We had built a life in the comfortable, well-defined territory of platonic companionship. But tonight, he had wandered across the border, sleepwalking into my closely guarded heart, and I had simply held the gate open for him. I wondered if he had any idea. Did he feel the shift in the atmosphere between us? Or was I just a convenient source of quiet and comfort, a piece of furniture in the room of his life that happened to be soft enough to lean on? The not knowing was the worst part. It was a constant state of suspension, of holding my breath, waiting for a sign that would never come. I must have drifted off in my chair, because the next thing I knew, the quality of the light in the room had changed. The deep, inky black of night had softened to the bruised purple of pre-dawn. I blinked, my neck stiff, my body aching from sleeping in such an awkward position. My first instinct was to look at the bed. He was still there, but he had shifted again. He was on his side now, facing away from me, curled into a gentle cama. The blanket I had put on him had slipped down to his waist. For a moment, everything was still, and the fragile peace of the night before seemed to hold. Then he stirred. He made a soft sound in the back of his throat and stretched, his back arching. And then he went still. I knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that he was awake. I held my breath. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was taut, stretched thin, humming with the unbearable tension of two people pretending to be asleep. What was he thinking? Was he embarrassed? Confused? Was he trying to figure out how to extricate himself from the situation without waking me? Each second that passed felt like an eternity. I kept my own breathing slow and even, my eyes closed, feigning a sleep I was miles away from. I was giving him an out, a chance to slip away and pretend this never happened. We could both wake up in our own beds, and the ritual could reset, the boundary lines hastily redrawn. It would be the safe thing, the smart thing. But he didn't move. He just lay there, perfectly still, his back to me. I could feel his wakefulness. It was a palpable presence in the room, a change in the energy. He was thinking, processing, and I was trapped in my chair, a prisoner of my own feigned sleep. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he moved. He pushed himself up slowly, quietly, onto one elbow. I could hear the faint rustle of the sheets. I risked opening my eyes to a mere slit. Through my eyelashes, I could see his silhouette against the gray light of the window. He was looking at me, at my slumped form in the chair. His expression was unreadable in the dim light, but his gaze was intense. He looked for a long, searching moment. I felt like a photograph being developed, my true nature slowly emerging under his steady gaze. Then, with a quiet sigh, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, stood up, and walked silently out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. The moment the latch clicked, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The tension in the room dissipated, leaving behind a hollow ache. It was over. The threshold had been crossed, and then, just as quietly, uncrossed. He had retreated. We were back in our separate territories. I felt a confusing mix of relief and profound disappointment. Nothing had happened, and yet everything had changed. The unspoken rules had been broken, and the memory of his warmth in my bed was now a permanent part of the room's geography. I stood up, my joints protesting, and walked over to the bed. The sheets were still warm where he had been lying. There was a faint indentation on the pillow. I reached out and touched the spot, the cotton cool against my fingertips, and felt an ache of loneliness so sharp it was like a physical pain. The mirage had vanished, and I was left alone in the desert, the memory of water making my thirst all the more acute. The aftermath was a study in excruciating subtlety. For the next few days, Julian was a ghost. He was polite, distant. The easy camaraderie we shared had been replaced by a careful, measured courtesy. He was up and out of the apartment before I woke up. He came home late, after I was already in my room. The kitchen encounters were brief and stilted. "Hey," he'd say, not quite meeting my eyes. "Hey," I'd reply, my voice feeling foreign in my own mouth. We moved around each other like two dancers who had forgotten the steps, bumping into the furniture and stepping on each other's toes. The silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was a chasm. He didn't mention the night in my room, and neither did I. It became a silent, unacknowledged event, a ghost haunting the hallways of our apartment. I was losing my mind. My internal monologue was a relentless loop of analysis and self-recrimination. Had I done something wrong? Did he somehow know how I felt? Did my staring at him in his sleep somehow translate into a creepy vibe that had pushed him away? Or was he simply embarrassed? Was he reevaluating our friendship, worried that he had taken advantage of my kindness? I replayed the night over and over, dissecting every moment, searching for a clue I might have missed. His weary request, my silent nod, the way he slept, his quiet departure. It was a puzzle with 1,000 possible solutions, and all of them led to the same conclusion. I had allowed myself to hope, and that hope had been a mistake. The beautiful, fragile structure of our friendship was collapsing, and I didn't know how to stop it. The ritual was broken. He didn't come to my room to study. He holed himself up in his own room or stayed late at the library. The door to my room, which had become a symbol of invitation, remained closed. The apartment felt too big, the silence too loud. I missed the sound of his pencil scratching on paper. I missed the steady rhythm of his breathing as he slept. I missed him. It was a simple, painful truth. I had grown so accustomed to his presence, to the quiet orbit we shared, that his absence was a physical void. The safe harbor had been abandoned, and I was adrift. After a week of this agonizing distance, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I would rather have the painful truth than this slow death by 1,000 silent rejections. I decided I had to do something. I had to breach the silence. It was terrifying. I was the observer, the one who never interfered. But the composition had been ruined. The photograph was already flawed. Doing nothing was no longer an option. That night, I waited for him to come home. I heard his key in the lock around 10. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding a nervous, unsteady rhythm, and went out to the living room. He was standing in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, his back to me. He looked just as tired as he had the night he first fell asleep in my room. But this was a different kind of exhaustion. It was a tense, brittle weariness. "Julian," I said. My voice was steady, much to my surprise. He flinched, startled by my presence. He turned around slowly, his face a mask of careful neutrality. "Hey, Leo. Didn't see you there. We need to talk," I said, the words feeling heavy and momentous in the quiet room. His face shuddered. A flicker of something, fear, annoyance, crossed his features before he smoothed it away. "Yeah? What's up?" He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. It was a defensive posture, a wall he was building between us. I took another breath, forcing myself to hold his gaze. "About last week," I said, keeping my tone even. "About you, about my room. You've been weird ever since, and I need to know what's going on. If I did something that made you uncomfortable, you need to tell me. Because this avoidance thing is not working." He looked away, staring at the floor, at the wall, at anything but me. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer, that he was just going to shut down completely. I felt a surge of panic, the fear that I had just made everything 100 times worse. But then he spoke, his voice so low I could barely hear him. "It's not you," he said. "You didn't do anything. Then what is it?" I pressed, my voice softening slightly. "Because it feels like you're a million miles away. I thought we were friends, Julian. Friends talk to each other." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a confusion so profound it startled me. He looked like a man trying to read a map in a language he didn't understand. "I don't know what's going on, Leo," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "That's the problem. I woke up in your bed, and you were in the chair, and I don't know. It felt different how?" I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster. This was it, the moment of truth. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, shaking his head. "It's just, when I'm in your room, it's the only place I feel like I can actually breathe lately. Everything is so quiet, so calm. And when I woke up, it just felt right. Being there. And that scared the hell out of me." My mind was racing, trying to process his words. It felt right. It scared me. The two phrases were a contradiction, a paradox that held the key to everything. He wasn't scared of me. He was scared of how not scared he was. He was scared of how comfortable it felt. "Why did it scare you, Julian?" I asked gently, taking a tentative step closer. He looked at me, his gaze direct and vulnerable for the first time in a week. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "it's not supposed to feel right. You're my roommate. You're my friend. You're Leo. And I'm not supposed to feel that way." "Feel what way?" I whispered back, my own voice trembling. The space between us was electric, charged with all the things we hadn't said for years. He just shook his head again, a look of helpless turmoil on his face. He didn't have the words. He was an engineer, a man of logic and concrete answers. This was uncharted emotional territory for him, and he was completely lost. And in that moment, seeing his confusion, his fear, I understood. He wasn't rejecting me. He was struggling with himself. The unknowing initiator had finally become aware of what he was initiating, and he didn't know what to do with the knowledge. All my fear, all my anxiety, melted away, replaced by a sudden, fierce wave of protectiveness. He wasn't pushing me away out of disgust. He was pulling back out of terror at his own feelings. I closed the remaining distance between us, stopping just a foot away from him. "Hey," I said softly, forcing him to meet my eyes. "Look at me." He did, his own eyes wide and uncertain. "It's okay," I said. "Whatever you're feeling, it's okay." I don't know where the courage came from. It felt like it was being drawn from some deep, untapped well inside me. I had spent my life observing, but now I had to act. I slowly, deliberately, reached out and placed my hand on his arm. His muscles tensed under my touch, a reflexive flinch. But he didn't pull away. I could feel the warmth of his skin through his shirt sleeve, the frantic, thrumming pulse beneath. We stood there for a long moment, frozen in that tableau. Me, with my hand on his arm. Him, with a world of confusion in his eyes. The silence was no longer a chasm. It was a vessel, and it was filling up with a new, terrifying, and beautiful possibility. He looked down at my hand on his arm, then back up at my face. His expression was a mixture of fear and something else, something I couldn't quite name. It looked like dawning recognition, like a man seeing a familiar landscape for the first time in a new light and realizing it was more beautiful than he had ever imagined. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. And then, he did something that shattered the last of my defenses. He leaned forward, ever so slightly, and rested his forehead against mine. It was a gesture of complete and utter surrender. I could feel his breath on my face, warm and unsteady. My own breathing stopped altogether. We stood like that, in the middle of our kitchen, foreheads touching, my hand on his arm, anchored to each other in a sea of confusion. "I'm so tired of fighting it," he murmured, his voice muffled against me. "Fighting what?" I asked, my own voice barely audible. He was silent for a moment. I could feel the tremor running through his body. "This," he finally said. "Whatever this is. I want to go back to your room. I want to go back to the quiet." It was a confession. It was a plea. It was everything I had ever wanted to hear, wrapped in the language of his exhaustion and confusion. He wasn't saying he loved me. He wasn't saying he understood what was happening. He was just saying he wanted to be near me. And for now, that was more than enough. I gently pulled back, just enough to see his face. His eyes were closed, his long lashes dark against his pale skin. He looked like he was in pain, but also, for the first time in a week, like he was on the verge of relief. "Okay," I said softly. "Let's go." I kept my hand on his arm and led him, like a man guiding a sleepwalker, out of the kitchen, down the short hallway, and to the door of my room. The door that had been closed for a week. I pushed it open. The room was dark, just as we had left it. It was waiting for us. I led him inside and he went, without hesitation, to the bed. This time, there was no pretext of studying. There were no textbooks, no pencils. He just sat on the edge of the mattress, his shoulders slumped, looking utterly spent. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat down next to him, leaving a few inches of careful space between us. We sat in the comfortable darkness, the silence rebuilding itself around us. But this time it was different. It was a silence born not of avoidance, but of acceptance. "Would it be okay?" he asked after a long time, his voice quiet and tentative in the dark. "If I stayed here tonight? I mean, really stay?" The question hung in the air between us, shimmering with unspoken meaning. He wasn't asking to crash because he was tired. He was asking for permission to be vulnerable. He was asking me to let him into my space, into my life, in a way that could not be undone. My heart, which had been through a marathon of emotions, gave a final, powerful surge. This was the threshold, the real one, and he was standing on it, waiting for me to let him in. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Yes, Julian. It would be okay." He let out a slow, shaky breath, a sound of profound relief. He sagged forward, his fight finally over. Then, he turned to face me on the bed. In the dim moonlight, I could just make out the shape of his face, the dark pools of his eyes. He was so close. I could feel the heat of him, smell the faint, familiar scent of his skin. He lifted a hand, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were moving through water. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his fingers hovering in the space between us. And then, he cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking gently against my cheek. His touch was electric, a spark that ignited every nerve ending in my body. It was a question, a confirmation, a final, silent request for permission. I leaned into his touch, a barely perceptible movement, and that was all the answer he needed. He closed the last remaining distance between us and kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss like in the movies. It was quiet. It was tentative. It was a discovery. His lips were soft, hesitant, mapping the shape of mine with a gentle, searching pressure. It was a kiss that tasted of confusion and relief, and a yearning so deep it felt ancient. It was a question and an answer all at once. I responded with my own quiet uncertainty, my own years of pent-up longing. It was a conversation without words, a story told in the soft press of lips, in the gentle stroke of his thumb on my skin. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We didn't speak. There were no words that could capture the magnitude of what had just happened. He didn't pull away. He just rested his forehead against mine again, his hand still cradling my face. I could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched my own. We stayed like that for a long time, just breathing each other in, letting the reality of the moment settle over us. The world had tilted on its axis. The map had been redrawn. The quiet observer had become a participant. The unknowing initiator had finally declared his intent. Nothing was the same, and yet everything felt, for the first time, exactly as it was supposed to be. Eventually, he pulled back, his eyes searching mine in the darkness. "Leo," he started, his voice thick. I put a finger to his lips, silencing him. "Shoo," I whispered. "No more talking. Not tonight. Just stay," he nodded, a small, grateful movement. We shifted on the bed, lying down to face each other, the thin space between our bodies humming with a new and powerful energy. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. His grip was firm, certain, and for the first time, in the quiet darkness of my room, with the man I loved lying beside me, I felt the profound, bone-deep peace of coming home. We didn't need to fill the silence anymore. We had learned to live inside it, together, and in the beautiful, honest quiet we had learned to create, we began to heal.